1942, a 9-year-old girl was living in a single unheated room inside a subdivided factory building in occupied D. No family with her except a sick mother. No stable food. No heat. No safety. She slept on a straw mattress near the door to avoid water dripping from the ceiling. This is how civilian survival actually worked. This is how it unfolded. The winter of 1942 descended upon the industrial districts of D with a cold that penetrated brick and mortar and settled into the bones of those who lived in unheated rooms. The city had been absorbed into the occupation apparatus, its factories repurposed for wartime production, and its residential areas reorganized to accommodate shifting populations of workers and displaced persons. Snow fell intermittently throughout December and January, accumulating in streets that were cleared only along routes used for military and industrial transport. The sky remained overcast for weeks, casting a uniform gray light over rows of apartment blocks that had been subdivided and overcrowded beyond their original design capacity. Smoke rose from scattered chimneys, though fuel was scarce and fires were small and carefully rationed. The air carried the smell of coal smoke, industrial waste, and the odor of too many people living in too little space with inadequate sanitation. Anna Kowalska was 9 years old and lived with her mother in a single room on the 3rd floor of a building that had once housed factory workers in modest but adequate apartments. The structure had been partitioned after the occupation began, each original apartment divided into multiple units to accommodate the influx of laborers brought in to work the factories. Anna and her mother occupied what had been a hallway and part of a sitting room, a space roughly 12 feet by 8 feet with a single window that faced an interior courtyard. The walls were thin, constructed from wooden boards and plaster, and sounds from neighboring rooms carried clearly through the partitions. The ceiling showed cracks and water stains where the roof leaked during heavy rain or when snow melted. A cast iron stove stood in one corner, though fuel for it was rarely available, and the room remained unheated most of the time. Anna's mother worked in a textile factory several blocks away, a large facility that operated in shifts around the clock producing fabric for military use. She left before dawn and returned after dark, her hands rough and stained from handling dyes and chemical treatments. The work provided a small wage and access to official ration cards that allowed them to obtain food at distribution points. The rations consisted primarily of bread, potatoes, and occasionally a portion of turnips or cabbage. Soup was distributed at a communal kitchen attached to the factory, a thin broth made from vegetable scraps and bones that provided minimal nutrition but filled the stomach temporarily. Anna accompanied her mother to the distribution points when school was not in session, standing in lines that stretched for blocks while officials checked identification papers and allotted portions according to established schedules. The room where they lived contained minimal furniture. A wooden table and 2 chairs occupied the center of the space, their surfaces worn smooth from use. A metal trunk held their clothing and a few personal items that had survived the displacement from their previous home. Anna slept on a mattress stuffed with straw, placed on the floor near the door where it was away from the worst of the ceiling leaks. Her mother slept on a similar mattress positioned against the far wall. They shared 2 wool blankets and whatever additional layers of clothing they could pile on top of themselves during the night. The window had cracked panes covered with cardboard to block drafts, reducing the already limited light that entered during the day. Anna's daily routine began when her mother woke her in the early morning darkness. She dressed in layers of clothing, pulling on stockings that had been darned repeatedly, a wool dress that had belonged to an older cousin, and a coat that was too large and had to be secured with a belt. She wrapped a scarf around her head and neck, leaving only her face exposed. Breakfast, when available, consisted of a piece of bread and sometimes a cup of weak tea. Her mother divided the food carefully, cutting portions with a knife and placing them on the table. Anna noticed that her mother's portion was often larger, though she did not question this as she had been taught not to complain about food. The building housed approximately 40 families in spaces that had been designed for 12. A single stairwell connected all 3 floors, its wooden steps worn and creaking under constant use. The communal latrine was located in a small structure attached to the rear of the building, accessible through a doorway on the ground floor. The facility consisted of 4 enclosed stalls with simple wooden seats positioned over a pit that was emptied irregularly by workers assigned to sanitation duties. The odor from the latrine permeated the ground floor hallways, and the condition of the stalls deteriorated as usage increased and maintenance became less frequent. Anna attended school 3 days a week in a building that had been converted from a warehouse. Classes were held in large rooms with minimal heating, and students sat on benches at long tables, sharing textbooks and writing materials. Instruction was conducted in German, and Polish was forbidden. Anna struggled with the language, understanding only fragments of what was being taught. She copied letters and numbers from the chalkboard, her hands cold and stiff, her fingers barely able to grip the pencil. The school provided no meals, and by midday her stomach ached with hunger. She concentrated on remaining still and quiet, avoiding attention that might result in punishment. On days when there was no school, Anna accompanied her mother to the factory district, where she waited outside the gates or in nearby areas while her mother worked. She occupied her time by searching through waste bins located behind the factory buildings, looking for discarded food scraps. She found potato peels, cabbage cores, and occasionally pieces of bread that had been thrown away. She collected these items in a cloth bag and brought them home, where her mother would inspect them and determine what could be safely eaten. Some of the scraps were too rotten or contaminated, but others could be boiled into a soup that supplemented their rations. The physical toll of inadequate nutrition became evident over the course of the winter. Anna's face grew thinner, her cheekbones more prominent, and her eyes larger in proportion to her narrowed features. Her hair, which her mother tried to keep braided, became dry and brittle. She developed chronic diarrhea from eating spoiled food, the condition leaving her weak and dehydrated. Her mother treated this with boiled water and small amounts of salt when it could be obtained, but the problem persisted. Anna learned to manage the condition by eating less and by timing her trips to the latrine to avoid the busiest periods when lines formed. Lice became another persistent problem, not just for Anna but for most of the building's residents. The insects spread rapidly in overcrowded conditions where washing was difficult and clothing could not be properly cleaned. Anna could feel them moving in her hair and along the seams of her clothing. The itching was constant, and sleep was disrupted by the need to scratch. Her mother attempted to control the infestation by combing Anna's hair with a fine-toothed comb and by boiling their clothing when water and fuel were available, but these efforts provided only temporary relief. The building's population increased in late January when several families were relocated from another district that had been cleared for industrial expansion. These new arrivals were assigned to spaces that had not previously been occupied, including portions of the basement and a converted storage room on the second floor. The additional people strained the already inadequate facilities, and conflicts arose over access to the latrine and the use of the communal areas. Arguments occurred in the stairwell and hallways, voices raised in frustration over waiting times and perceived unfairness in the distribution of space. The ration portions decreased in early February, a reduction attributed to supply disruptions and increased demand. The bread allotment was cut by a third, and the soup distributed at the factory kitchen became even thinner, often consisting of little more than hot water with a few floating pieces of vegetable. Anna's hunger became more acute, a constant presence that dominated her awareness. She noticed that her mother seemed to eat less than before, often claiming she was not hungry and giving her portion to Anna. Yet Anna's own hunger never seemed to be satisfied by what she received, and she began to suspect that her mother was keeping part of the ration for some other purpose. This suspicion was confirmed when Anna discovered her mother meeting with another woman in the building's courtyard, exchanging a small bundle wrapped in cloth for a glass vial containing liquid. Anna watched from the window, understanding that food was being traded for medicine. Her mother suffered from a persistent cough that had worsened over the winter, and the medicine was likely intended to treat this condition. Anna said nothing about what she had seen, accepting that her mother had made a decision based on necessity, though the knowledge that food was being withheld left her feeling an emptiness that went beyond physical hunger. The structural failure occurred on a morning in mid-February, during a period when temperatures had dropped to their lowest point and ice had formed on the building's exterior surfaces. Anna and her mother were in their room when they heard a loud cracking sound followed by shouts from the stairwell. People began emerging from their rooms, looking toward the source of the noise. The wooden staircase connecting the second and third floors had partially collapsed, several steps giving way under the combined weight of accumulated ice and the constant traffic of dozens of residents. The damage had created a gap of approximately 4 feet, making passage between floors impossible without risk of falling. The immediate consequence was the loss of access to the ground floor for residents of the upper levels. This meant that the communal latrine could no longer be reached safely, and alternative arrangements had to be made. Some residents attempted to use the remaining portion of the stairwell by jumping across the gap, but this proved dangerous and resulted in injuries. Others began using buckets and containers in their rooms, disposing of waste by throwing it out windows into the courtyard. The building's administration was notified, but repairs were not scheduled immediately due to shortages of materials and labor. The situation deteriorated rapidly over the following days. The courtyard became contaminated with human waste, and the smell pervaded the entire building. The risk of disease increased as sanitary conditions collapsed. Anna and her mother joined others in using a bucket kept in their room, covering it with a cloth and emptying it from the window at night. The indignity of these arrangements was compounded by the inability to maintain even basic hygiene. Water for washing became more precious, as trips to the communal pump now required navigating the damaged stairwell or finding alternative routes that involved climbing through windows and across roofs. The psychological impact of these conditions manifested in different ways among the building's residents. Some became more aggressive, fighting over access to resources and blaming neighbors for the deteriorating situation. Others withdrew, spending more time in their rooms and minimizing interaction. Anna observed her mother becoming quieter, her cough worsening and her movements slower. The medicine obtained through trading food had provided no noticeable improvement, and the additional stress of the building's collapse seemed to drain what little energy remained. Anna herself began to retreat into a state of passive endurance. She stopped searching for food scraps, lacking the energy to walk to the factory district. She attended school irregularly, her absence unnoticed among the many children who had stopped coming. She spent long hours lying on her mattress, conserving warmth and energy, rising only when necessary. Her body adapted to chronic hunger by slowing down, her movements becoming deliberate and minimal. She noticed that her hair had begun to fall out in small clumps when she combed it, and that her gums bled when she ate the hard bread that constituted most of her diet. The winter continued into March with little improvement in conditions. The stairwell remained unrepaired, and several more steps collapsed, making the gap even wider. One family attempted to construct a makeshift bridge using planks, but the structure was unstable and collapsed when tested, injuring a child who fell through. The building's population began to decline as some families found alternative housing or were relocated by authorities. The exodus relieved some of the pressure on resources but also left the remaining residents more isolated and vulnerable. Anna's mother's condition worsened in late March. Her cough became violent, producing blood that stained the cloth she held to her mouth. She continued to work when she could, but she began missing shifts, and her wages were reduced accordingly. The loss of income meant further reduction in their already minimal resources. Anna understood that her mother was seriously ill but did not know what could be done. Medical care was available only through official channels that required documentation and payment, either of which they could provide. The war's progression brought changes to the city's industrial operations in the spring. Factories were retooled, workers were reassigned, and portions of the district were evacuated for security reasons. Anna and her mother were among those told to relocate, given notice that their building would be repurposed and that alternative housing would be provided. The relocation took them to a different part of the city, to a camp-like facility where families were housed in barracks with communal sleeping areas and centralized meal distribution. The conditions were in some ways better, with regular food allotments and functioning sanitation, but the loss of even the minimal privacy they had known in their room was significant. Anna's mother died in the summer of 1943, succumbing to the respiratory illness that had weakened her throughout the winter. Anna was placed in an institutional care facility for orphan children, a large converted school building where she shared a dormitory with dozens of other girls. She remained there for the duration of the war, receiving basic education and training in sewing and domestic work. The care was institutional and impersonal, but it provided stability and adequate nutrition for the first time in years. When the war ended, Anna was 12 years old and was placed with a foster family in a rural area outside the city. She remained with them through her teenage years, working on their farm and attending school irregularly. She completed basic education and at 18 found employment in a textile factory, work that was similar to what her mother had done. She married at 22 to a man who worked as a mechanic, and they had 3 children. The family lived in a small apartment in a housing development built during the post-war reconstruction period. Anna rarely spoke about the winter she had spent in the subdivided building with the collapsed stairwell and the deteriorating sanitation. The memories remained but were kept separate from her daily life, surfacing only occasionally in moments of particular stress or when she encountered situations that reminded her of that time. She maintained habits formed during those months, never wasting food, always ensuring her children were fed adequately, and keeping her living space meticulously clean despite limited resources. She avoided discussing illness and would become agitated if her children showed signs of respiratory problems, insisting on immediate treatment even when costs were prohibitive. She worked in the textile factory for 25 years, eventually becoming a supervisor overseeing quality control. She approached the work with precision and an insistence on proper conditions, advocating for better ventilation and safety measures even when such advocacy was discouraged. She retired in her early 50s due to health problems related to years of exposure to industrial chemicals, and she spent her remaining years helping to care for her grandchildren and maintaining a small garden where she grew vegetables with meticulous attention. Anna died in 1996 at the age of 63, her body worn by the accumulated effects of childhood malnutrition and decades of industrial labor. Her children, when settling her modest estate, found among her possessions a small cloth bag of the type that might have been used to collect scraps, folded and stored in a drawer. They also found a chipped enamel cup that she had kept despite having no practical use for it, an object whose significance they could not determine. These items were discarded as they had no apparent value, their connection to a 9-year-old child's survival in a collapsing building during the winter of 1942 unknown to those who had not lived through such circumstances. The experiences that had shaped Anna's approach to life, her caution around illness, her insistence on cleanliness, and her careful management of food, had been formed in those rooms with thin walls and leaking ceilings, in the lines for rations and the searches through waste bins, and in the long hours of lying still on a straw mattress trying to conserve energy while hunger gnawed and the building deteriorated around her.